welcome everyone to the Problem Structuring Methods Special Interest Group. If I could ask, please, just everyone to mute as you come in, that would be really appreciated, just so we keep any noise down on the line. And also, in terms of questions, please could you put questions into the chat, and we'll pick those up at the end. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. So welcome to Luke Maggs. We're delighted to have Luke with us. Christina and I have had wonderful discussions with Luke in the sort of run up to this event, and we're really looking forward to this talk on the role of OR and analytics in sustainability. It's going to be really fascinating to look at some of the kind of real world problems of natural resources Wales, looking at sort of how we deal with those, how you take an operational research view of those. So over to you, Luke.
Brill, thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. So delighted to be here today to share some of our work and our thinking really on the role of operations research and analytics, as the title says, in tackling sustainable management of natural resources. And we basically are talking about implementing sustainable development. My name is Luke Maggs. I work for this organisation called Natural Resources Wales, and I'm their lead operational researcher, which sounds quite a grand title for an OR person of one, but I sit in a multidisciplinary team. So there's about 17, 18 of us, and we cover quite a broad range of topics and disciplines. We provide an integrated evidence service. So what that means in practice is I work closely with a range of different disciplines, and this is something I want to kind of make sure we cover during the talk, is this kind of multidisciplinary approach to complex problem solving. Like obviously a big fan of OR and the mathematical thinking and operational research techniques, but we need to use them in combination with the social sciences, the economic sciences, the modeling disciplines, that range of kind of domains. And it's really to kind of integrate our evidence, our information across the cultural, social, and economic domains, I suppose is the best way to think about it. So the structure of the talk today, I was going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes setting out who we are, what we do, and how we're attempting to tackle this kind of dual crisis of nature, climate, and pollution. So I think often we talk about net zero and we talk about the need to decarbonize and reduce our emissions. Like rarely are we talking about it in context with tackling the biodiversity crisis we find ourselves in and limiting the impact of pollution and environmental degradation. So I'm hoping particularly that with the expertise in this room that you'll be able to offer us some assistance and insights into the challenges and some of our issues that we have with reporting on all of this. We have a really, just before everybody joined the call, I was talking to Martin and Christina around the variety and breadth of the remit that NRW has and the kind of statutory and legal things that we need to cover. And one of those, and that's the focus of today's talk, is this 5-year, this quinquennial, so 5-year cycles in needing to report back to government, our Welsh government, on the current state of natural resource management in Wales. This is actually a massive undertaking as we have to work with a range of experts. We need to synthesize across a variety of kind of hard and softer sciences and bring together many different sources of evidence and insights. So I'm going to crack on with the talk now, but what I will say is, as Martin and others have suggested, pop your questions in the chat window. I'm going to cover quite a lot of content today, and I'm not an expert in all of this. I'm going to do my best to present it in non-technical language. Sometimes we drown in acronyms and we use perverse terms to explain quite simple things, but any problems, pop your hand up, shout out questions. There will be opportunity at the end. So in terms of a little bit of background, who are we and what do we do? We are an all Wales body. We sit within the United Kingdom. Obviously, we have United Kingdom law and legislation that covers us all, but some things are devolved. So there is different legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, particularly when it gets to this kind of concept of environmental management. So as a statutory body, we're one of the largest assembly-sponsored bodies, and we have about 2,000, maybe depending on how you count it with our contractors, 2,200 staff across Wales with an operational budget of around about 200 million. Sounds, depending on your sector and your background, that could be considered a lot of money. On the other hand, when you consider the breadth of what we do, it's actually not a large amount. We were formed from an amalgamation of the Forestry Commission, the Environment Agency, and the then Countryside Council for Wales. So for my English colleagues, then that would be the equivalent of bringing together the Forestry Commission, Natural England, and the Environment Agency. And we've basically merged all of those environmental functions. And in terms of what that means we cover, we do things like we advise on government issues. So we provide advice to industry and the wider public and voluntary sector. We'll communicate issues about the natural environment and the resources. We have to regulate things. We'll regulate marine installations, forest installations, waste, industry, even nuclear power stations. We will have to designate sites of special scientific interest. We will manage particular wildlife reserves, forest parks. We are actually a Category 1 responder. We're not a blue light service, but we do deal with air quality pollution incidents. Predominantly our emergency response at the moment is around flooding, but that may shift as we move into the future and certain things are kind of happening. We'll touch on that in the talk shortly. And we also manage and respond to huge amounts of planning applications, sort of about 10,000 applications a year. So what you're seeing on the map here is obviously the United Kingdom, then you've got Wales on the right-hand side and a variety of some of our sites. One thing I did want to show you quickly, if we were to talk, and I'll talk about broad ecosystems, that can get very technical, or you can think GCSE geography, and it's a case of how do you package up and bucket up the land. The map you're seeing here of Wales is a map of 8 different ecosystem types. Now, don't want you to dwell on it, but what you will see quite quickly there, it looks a bit complex, it's a bit messy. There's a huge amount of enclosed farmland, and actually the divisions can be a bit tricky to see once you're out on the ground. So hold that complexity in the mind. There are 8 types of ecosystem, broadly speaking, and we'll touch on those as we run through the talk. So just thought I'd kick us off with a few nice pictures. I'm not working for Visit Wales, but I would highly encourage anybody who's not been here before to come. We've got some amazing sites. I live just in North Cardiff. I'm a stone's throw away from the South Wales valleys, and this image up on the, I think this works in terms of highlight, my little red dot. This image up here in the Woodlands area, we're 20 minutes north of the capital city of Cardiff. There's mountain bike trails. There's the furthest extent of beech woodland in Western Europe. So this is a protected site for its beech forestry and all the rich kind of mosaics and habitats that sit there. You've got the national nature reserves out in Pembroke and the glorious beaches. Like, I'm a really keen rock climber and mountaineer, and you will struggle to find a better cliff and a better beach on the planet than places in Pembroke. And then you've got lovely places up in mid Wales, and I've not even touched on the mountain regions in North Wales. But anyway, a couple of lovely pictures there, and just to give you a bit of an idea of the types of things that we manage. Now, in terms of the talk today, I wanted to frame it in the context, and I'm certainly not here to spread doom or gloom or any kind of pessimism, but we are living in interesting times. It's a deeply uncertain moment in history. We sit on the cusp of deep political instabilities. You only need to look at the news today and you see the amount of kind of wildfire and air pollution that you're seeing in North America. We're sat in an El Nino year. There could be some major coral bleaching events. There's a huge amount of kind of disruption to our weather systems. And yet alongside all of that is the social fabric of society. Now, some of the graphics you're seeing on here, you'll probably recognize. Take, for instance, the kind of Asian demographics. In Wales, I think, if I remember correctly, the figures are something in the region of by 2040, 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 65. Now, that has implications to the level of tax revenue. It has implications to the strength and expenditure of the public sector. It has drains on family structure and the need to provide different types of facilities. Potentially we have to start delivering more dementia-friendly trails. We need to start thinking about the ways that we offer different structures. You look at something like this little fella over here, which disrupted all of our lives for a few years. This is the COVID, or it's a representation of the COVID virus. It's interesting to reflect on. Since 2000, we've seen MERS, Ebola, H1N1, COVID, and all of these, there are many different reasons and rationale for their cause. I would argue as an environmentalist that some of this is about this interface with humanity. As we expand out, all of those kind of diseases and viruses are as a direct consequence of humanity's encroachment into the natural world. Now, whether that's set to get worse or not, it does sort of show the level of risk. We are in this situation where there are kind of extinction. We all think about net zero and this need to keep within a few degrees of warming. Meanwhile, we've got, depending on how you calculate it, between 2 and 3 orders of magnitude extinction rates above the base rate. We are losing species and biodiversity at a phenomenal rate. And that can be really worrying because when you think about it, it's that keeps the biosphere alive. As a room full of OR professionals, I'd expect the majority of you to recognize this thing in the bottom left-hand corner. But for those that don't, this is a representation of a neural network. We've seen the explosion in generative AI and the kind of hype and the buzz around it. Now, some amazing things that can be done with it, and also a little bit of hype with its potential usefulness to solve problems. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is around this kind of just transition to a better environmental future. So we know AI is going to play a huge part over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of all the jobs that we do. We're not yet sure how well that will land, how equally it will be distributed, how equitably it will be implemented, and who are the winners and losers in all of this, and how will it be used to kind of change the world around us. So again, just framing it in that big picture, I think it's interesting to reflect and also to think about the rate of change. NLW is about 10 years old. In that time, we've seen crazy things happen, and I'm sure more will happen in the future. So as we look at this, I wanted to make sure that you realized it wasn't just environmentalists, and I'm sure none of you on the call would think that, but this was really interesting for anybody that didn't pick it up. In 2021, we saw a simultaneous publication of all the editors of the most prestigious health journals in the world. Now, to my knowledge, this hasn't been happened before. They simultaneously published this kind of call to action around, well, look, as a public health crisis, climate change is front and center. Now, I thought that was really quite groundbreaking. And like I said, it's not really happened before. Following on from that, you sort of question, well, okay, well, what is society doing about it? Just before everybody joined the call, I was sort of explaining that it's important to frame this in a non-negative and doom and gloom fashion. There are good things happening, and certainly things like the COP conferences and the biodiversity conferences are starting to show how humanity and the globe are coming together and recognizing these problems. And we've had great commitments signed up to in Glasgow. 30 by 30 is the one that most people will be familiar with, and the need to kind of protect large amounts of habitats. On the flip side, since those conferences, we probably lost about 10% of our forests in the tropics. Now, that's equivalent to about the annual emissions of India in terms of fossil fuels. So that's a phenomenal rate of change. And despite all of this, we are still moving in a bad direction. Now, that's okay as long as we understand the kind of dynamics and what's those driving factors. But I think it is interesting. I think it's COP27 and COP15. So the 27 is about the climate change bit. The 15 is the 15th conference of the parties. Now, all I'm highlighting here is the different levels to which climate is treated relative to biodiversity. And for us, we tend to think of them as a twin crisis. You can't tackle one without the other. So I thought, that's kind of an interesting sort of point to reflect on. And when you think about some of the negative effects on this, we in NLW particularly, we're quite concerned with flooding and protecting lives from things like that. Meanwhile, there are these kind of silent killers that are, huge amount of, depending on how you calculate it, it's either total lives lost, or it could be X number of million years. I think it's 2 million years at a European level lost just to bad air quality. And that's kind of indoors. So we're emitting lots of bad particles and emissions. So that kind of stuff is really worrying. So who's doing what about it? I was quite taken by this report. And interestingly, this wasn't commissioned by any of the environmental NGOs. It wasn't the environmental agencies. This was actually the UK's Treasury. The UK Treasury commissioned an independent report by Sir Partha Dasgupta to look at the economics of biodiversity. Now, I'm no economist, but I sit in a team, multidisciplinary team with an economist. I've learned a lot over the last few years. And this kind of concept of maximum value for the shareholders is at the heart of all these kind of sustainability issues. Now, my understanding of economics is that it's typically, there's a kind of factor production model, and you look at the kind of total amount of humans and the capital, or the labor that the humans provide plus the capital equals your productivity. And it doesn't account well for the degradation in the natural capital or social capital. Now, it's a bit naive to try to think you are going to just value that and then put the numbers into the equation. What you've actually got to do is neatly sidestep it. So I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but the general concept is that we are using the natural resources at a rate that is unsustainable. We are in effect living off our overdraft, and we're not replenishing the stocks and the accounts. It's easy to show these kind of graphics. It is a little bit more in depth. It's a deep report if people haven't read it before. There is an impact inequality equation, a little bit of maths for the OR crowd, but what we're trying to do here is look at the human population, their economic activity, the rate at which they turn the biosphere and goods they extract into GDP, and then how much it can kind of be replenished. And that, obviously, I don't need to kind of tell you that we're not living in a sustainable manner. This is actually interesting, though, that it was the UK Treasury Commission in it, and it's business reflecting on the fact that this is everybody's problem. It's a societal problem. So I'm trying to paint that large picture at the kind of global scale. And then you come down to the devolved government in Wales and what we're trying to do about it. Now, we're quite fortunate in Wales that we have a really unique piece of, well, we have a couple of unique pieces of legislation and a good policy sector. Now, quite often you are, as an environmentalist, hoping that things get translated into legislation and that you're able to influence policy. I feel in Wales we're possibly a step ahead of the curve in that we've got that structure. We've got a really fantastic Environment Act, which gave rise to Natural Resources Wales. It was why we were formed. In my mind, one of the good pieces of legislation, and some of you might have heard about this, is the Future Generations Act. This is actually quite unique in that it puts a statutory duty on all public bodies to collaborate, to think collectively about how you will deliver across the UN sustainable goals and this concept of 7 kind of well-being goals that integrate across the 4 dimensions of well-being, and that's the social, the economic, the cultural, and the environmental. What that means in practice, again, is that you will have large public service groups that come together. Is typically at a kind of administrative boundary level. So we will sit on a statutory partnership with fire and rescue, with the health boards, with the local authorities. And the task is to consider not only the needs and pressures of today, but also to consider the future generations. And that's the ones yet to be born. So in public health circles, there's a strong emphasis on if you want to tackle problems in future, you address what's called adverse childhood experiences in the first 1,000 days of life. So that's the first couple of years of life, isn't it? If you get that wrong, you're kind of already on the back foot. So we have this kind of approach in Wales where even the Government of Wales Act 2006 enshrines into our legislation the duty to do sustainable development. The difficulty is how you do it. And that's what I guess our big challenge is, really. So again, like looking at this looks really pretty, nice and colorful. When you sort of try to unpack that and realize that this change happens over multiple dimensions, both spatial and temporal, it has many different dynamics and feedback loops. It has a lot of shared and contested values, and there's almost like no neat and clean way through it. There are many different kind of boundaries to be considered. There are many different integrated policies and things that don't integrate. And whilst they did form NRW with all this unique legislation and great policy, it wasn't like all the other stuff got removed. So in a way, you were piling some complexity on top. We have this duty to report back to governments, the central government, so our Welsh government, and to say to them, okay, this is what's happening with your management of natural resources. It's no longer good enough to just count all of the things and say there are X number of sites, there are X number of species. We've now got to start taking an objective assessment of the quality and sustainability of the management and some of those opportunities for action. And it's not for us to take all of those decisions. We are a statutory public body there to provide advice, deliver a service, and try to help the public sector and others in delivering this. So the piece of work I wanted to kind of bring before you today is this thing called the State of Natural Resources report. So this is our sonar report, and in this we are supposed to be considering all of this stuff. And if I said to you today, go and have a look at sonar and look at the executive summary, it's about 50 pages, just the executive summary. Now, I remember the National Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2000. That was a tomb that landed on your desk. So how you go about taking all of this complexity and starting to translate it into sensible human things that can be understood across many different sectors, that's actually a really tricky thing. And no spoilers, but we're not actually achieving sustainable management of natural resources yet. And there is hope. There's always a lot of hope, and actually we're doing some really good things, and much of this is quite unpredictable and chaotic, and yet within that you've got to try and make sense of some of this. So what I thought I would try to do then in the latter part of this talk now is to kind of cover our approach to sonar, some of the challenges that we have with it, and what we're actually trying to do, because I think sometimes you get lost in these acronyms and issues. One thing I would say, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, was actually if you sort of zoomed out at a global scale, what are we actually trying to do? Anybody who's not heard of them, I'd encourage you to look it up. There were some in the late 90s, they developed these kind of principles for ecosystem management, and they're called the Malawi principles. And it really just basically, to me, frames the challenge society has. There's no clear answers to these things. Quite often, a lot of these management objectives are actually a matter of societal choice. People are at the center of this. Who's asking, who's choosing. These are important things. If you want to do sustainable development, you need to decentralize it to the lowest appropriate level. Now, the key word there is appropriate. Sometimes that's national, sometimes that's local, sometimes that's your street. It kind of depends. So what is NRW doing in this space? We are obviously an environmental, typically scientifically focused organization. We are rich in what I would call geospatial data. We're heavily map focused. We have a lot of kind of remote sensing as well. We've got some great kind of LiDAR data. we present a lot of this information, we package it up and we put it online. And we've got things like the Wales Environmental Portal. We've got these kind of maps that show you kind of opportunities. And we're also involved in the non-spatial kind of data collection, which starts to look at maybe population-based trends on perceptions and barriers to use and access of nature. But within all of that, we then need to start trying to get a better handle on this whole concept of, well, what is sustainable management of natural resources? Like, who's saying what it is and how do we kind of evaluate it? So just to quickly run you through our thinking on this, these first two aims, aim 1 and aim 2, are kind of the preserve of the environmental scientist. You know, the first one is your stuff okay? You know, you have these environmental assets, whether that's a species, a butterfly, it could be a stock of forest, it could be fish in the river. Are your stocks of the natural resources safeguarded and enhanced? Okay, kind of, you could envisage how that's possible. Within those, so those stocks, those things, they sit within broad ecosystem types. And that first map that I showed you with the different kind of ways of looking at Wales, some of the stocks will sit within enclosed farmlands, some are a marine stock, some are a woodland stock. Quite difficult when you're out on the ground to see the difference between farmland and woodland. There's a bit of a blurring at the boundary, but these first two are fairly self-evident. We can start to understand a bit how we do it. Aims 3 and 4 are actually, to my mind, a bit of the crux of the problem. We talk about these natural resources need to deliver for both the environment, but critically, the health and well-being of the population in Wales. When we talk about health and well-being, there's two components. It's the prevention. So are we making sure that we're mitigating bad air quality? Do we plant things in the right places to reduce particle emission? Do we ensure that industry is well regulated so it doesn't emit things? Do we tackle diffuse pollution, that kind of stuff? And then also, can we make sure there are equal or equitable opportunities for people to have good quality recreation in order to improve their health? And again, that sounds great, but one person's quiet recreation is another person's noisy hell. So you've got to kind of balance those issues. Aim number 4, a regenerative economy. Well, that's really difficult. You know, we are not business people. We typically don't understand these things well. It's quite tricky to wrap your head around, well, what is GDP and how is it measured? God, don't even open that can of worms. That could be really messy. But yet, this is what the legislation is tackling, is telling us to do. It's saying, NLW, you need to report back on, are you moving in the right direction towards achieving all of these 4 aims? And if not, why not? And where are the opportunities for action? So that's kind of what we've been trying to do. Again, bringing it back to the real world, on the left-hand side, you're seeing a really lovely picture. This is actually one of the only flat-top mountains in Western Europe, to my knowledge, and it's in the Rhondda. It's a beautiful place if you've never walked. Everybody goes to the Brecon Beacons to go walking. The hidden gem in Wales is the valleys, South Wales valleys, amazing places to go walking. Some beautiful scenery. Some of the greatest people on earth. I think, you know, the communities there are amazing. But what you're seeing there, go back 50, 60 years ago, I think the South Wales Valleys is one of the few areas in the UK you can hand on heart say that the environment is better today than it's been in a generation. We are seeing black to green. So I'm saying, yes, the world is on fire and everything's bad, but at the same time, there are pockets of hope. And there's some really good stories, even within our local backyards. And again, it's for the future generations. It's for the children yet to be born and that next generation. Now, I think there's all kinds of terrible statistics that you see a lot of the time in the South Wales valleys. But again, just remember there are people living in a place. And I think it's really important to kind of keep that in the back of our minds. So as we start to produce our sonar report and we explain all of this stuff, we take a broad ecosystem approach, you know, 8 different types of ecosystems. So I've popped them up on the screen. The one we're going to be talking about today is this coastal margins. But we're not saying that's the only way to look at it. There are also these cross-cutting themes. So things like air quality, you know, that's going to cross all different types of habitats. Whether we have good resource efficiency with energy, or we are using our water sources effectively, or the waste products, those are difficult questions. And you know, there's a bit of a paradox. If you save a lot of energy, you potentially use more energy. So these things are tricky for us to tackle. But we have to still consider them. I quite like this. We've got all these different kind of types of evidence. And I think sometimes we hide behind the word evidence. There's scientific evidence, there's economic evidence, there's political evidence. How you turn all of this into a coherent picture, and whose picture is it, and how do you create it? You know, that's difficult, and you're not always going to get agreement and consensus. So coastal margins, if you take this as a kind of example, within sonar, we have these 8 different ecosystem types. each one of those in effect has an assessment of the state of the natural resources and the management. So considering the coast, on the left hand side, you're seeing the kind of the big sort of area at the coast over Whitford Sands, beautiful area. A colleague of mine is in this truck down here. We were flying a drone to survey the wetland and the kind of coastal fringes and the kind of salt marshes. And on the right hand side, near sort of South Wales, the heritage coastline, beautiful cliffs, huge amounts of sea level rise pressure, coastal erosion. Sea levels are rising. We've known that. There's an argument that they are accelerating due to climate change. Regardless of all of that, what's happening is behind the coastline, what the natural environment wants to do is roll up and back and achieve this concept of dynamic equilibrium. When humanity does stuff and activity behind it, it constrains the coastline, and it means that you exacerbate whatever natural trends and human trends on top, and you make it worse. So that's kind of the sort of stuff. If we were to look at this and say, how does sonar consider this kind of landscape and interface? We have this kind of framework, and I think it was alluded to in the invite to this session, it's called the DIPSA. It's the drivers, the pressures, the state, and the responses. And it's a reasonably well endorsed framework and approach at the sort of UN level. And what Wales is trying to do is embed the best research and practice in management of sustainability and tackling kind of landscape change. Now, we are not a research house ourselves. Some of our legacy agencies did do some research, but we ourselves have been set up and we know we don't have all the answers. So we go out to academics, we go out to groups like this with the expertise within it, and we say, this is what we're trying to do. And this is what we're trying to implement. And how can we iterate on it? So sonar has been published every 5 years. We have done 2. The first one was a typical environmental report where we counted all the things. The second one has moved us on a bit. And this third one, we're hoping, kind of takes us on again. And so we sort of think, okay, there's a collection of pressures and drivers. There's drivers, both human and natural, that in a sense create pressures that affect the state of the system, typically in a negative way, but not always. And that then feeds back and creates an impact. Now, it's very difficult to measure the impact directly. Often there's no counterfactual. It's quite hard to know what would have happened if you didn't. The responses is what society chooses to do. So there are some regulatory and statutory things at our disposal, and there are things that are already happening. And then there's also the democratic process, what society chooses to do, what it chooses to spend on, and how it goes about distributing the finite amount of resources. And I think it's only a madman or an economist that believes in a finite world you can carry on with exponential growth. That's just not going to happen. And yet that's the way society seems to be carrying on at the moment. So when we try to unpack this kind of conceptual framework, we start to think about the drivers and the pressures. What might that look like for the coast? So I'm aware of the time, so I'll rattle through these bits, but we are sort of saying, look, there's climate variability and there's also the human-induced change. Now, there's a human and a natural component. There's the kind of pollution and enrichment cycle. So I'm going down the driver column down here. There's the general habitat change, like things change. That's what happens in nature. And there's the invasive species or overexploitation that kind of culminates and delivers sort of pressures. So the changing weather patterns, the relative sea level rise, this issue of coastal squeeze and containment. You just think about how many cities will be under pressure if sea levels start to accelerate the way the models are predicting. And all models are wrong, aren't they? The famous George Box quote, but some are useful. So how do we kind of start acting on these? Air pollution and deposition is actually a really interesting one. Not many people seem to understand that there can be huge amounts of nitrogen deposition onto protected habitats and landscapes. And that leads to kind of concepts of eutrophication and increased, so that's more nutrients in the system. You think more nutrients is a good thing, but actually it's not. And it leads to competition and changes in species, typically not for the good. Quite often the problem is not that there's not been natural change, it's the rate of change and the ability for things to respond and be resilient to them. So we structure our sonar report. We take broad ecosystem types. We assess them both in terms of their drivers and pressures, the effect and the state of the system. We sort of put drivers and pressures together, and then we'll put the sort of state and effect together. From that, we also need to take a bit of an assessment of the biodiversity. Now, this is a really tricky one, and we have a model that kind of considers the diversity of the landscape. So that sort of says, in a crude way, more species diversity is better. Now, that does mean that occasionally you get very rare sites with single species that don't score as highly. But we need to be able to rank these. We need to also put a confidence on them. Now, that can be tricky because sometimes we don't have the resources to survey all this, but there's a quantification of diversity. So in this little quadrant here, We are looking at the diversity of the coastal lagoons, the salt marshes, the sand dunes, the sea cliffs. And the one that comes up really highly is obviously there's a lot of diversity in the sand dunes. Most of the coastline in South Wales at least would have been a natural dune system had we not decided to colonize it and build on it. Then you have to consider the extent, so the totality. Bigger is better usually, but it doesn't mean that it's good. And that comes down to the condition assessment. And you have to provide a bit of a qualitative assessment of it. Is it in good quality? Is it in bad quality? Is it degrading? And how confident are we in that assessment? The connectivity, and this is the crux of it really, some types of landscapes are more permeable than others. Some are more flexible and more resilient. So if we were to solve only one thing and you were to take away one thing from this talk, it's this concept of ecological connectivity. We are not solving many of these problems that I'm tackling today, or certainly not overnight. So as we adapt to change, it's about mitigation. It's about ensuring that where we have all these different special sites, they're quite fragmented. The ones that are more connected are arguably more valuable, and we should be building and restoring. And actually restoration is a very difficult one. Some people want to conserve what's there. Other people are saying, well, you need to restore it back to X, and who decides X? That's really tricky. This sort of culminates in what we call a natural resource register. So we've got some nice infographics on our website. We say they're nice. Are they? They might not be that useful. Some people love graphics, other people hate them. And are we just producing graphics for ourselves? We're not sure, but it's certainly better than our earlier iterations of the report. So what we've tried to do around here is we've tried to put the drivers, we've got the broad ecosystem types. I'm not expecting you to read all of this. It was just to sort of show you how the report is structured. And then down the side is the big list of all the different types of pressures, from competing land use and drainage to looking at access to nature, these coastal margins. And that's kind of basically the structure of Sonar. We have an evidence base. There are these cross-cutting themes and the broad ecosystem types. There's the general concept of what are we trying to do? Sustainable development through the management of natural resources. There's a set of natural resource registers, and we come up with an opportunity set, in effect, an opportunity set, a choice set, from which then the government decides what to do and where to spend its resources, along with society, because we all vote for government, or hopefully we do. We are really focused on this concept of nature-based solutions. So yes, we need renewable energy, but also we need to consider good quality habitat management. On the left-hand side, you're seeing a kind of a bit of sphagnum moss on a peat bog, and this is all about keeping peat locked up. It keeps the water, keeps the peat wet, will keep the carbon locked up. You will solve far more climate emissions by keeping your peatlands in good restoration than you will putting a few turbines on degraded landscapes. Equally, we need the turbines. Where do you put them? Who pays for them? All that kind of structure, difficult questions. So this is our general structure, and I will stop soon because I'm really keen on the discussion. But what I've been mostly talking about is the state of natural resources. Up here in the top right, top left, we've got the policy cycle, we've got all this complexity, but ultimately it's about, we don't want to keep writing all these reports. We want to get to the point where we are implementing the actions, and actually it's got to lead to action on the ground, because if we can't change the current status quo, we're not going to solve these grand challenges. Which brings me on to kind of, I guess, towards the end of the talk. And this was a really nice slide that I think was produced by DEFRA. Systems thinking is gathering a lot of momentum, at least in the environmental world. I know it's got a rich history in the OR world. Typically sits at either the hard or the soft end. So you'll get the engineers who want to do a lot of like hard systems dynamics and differential equation modeling. And then at the other end, there's like really strong role in the participatory systems map, sitting down with a broad section of society and exploring all of these shared and contested values. And in that context, the map is always wrong, but it's usually useful. And at the other end, you're trying to get to the point where you produce a kind of useful model that you can kind of predict or forecast with. Across here, you've got the range of group and individual responses and the qualitative and the quantitative. But I think it's interesting because I would hope that many of the people on the call would look at this and go, yeah, absolutely, we know all of this stuff, so how do we deploy it? In terms of where NRW is trying to get to, we've recently published our corporate plan, and within that, we quite clearly move from a position of just being a kind of statutory body into a more unusual space for us, which is around advocacy. We are trying to champion the dual climate and nature crisis and how we tackle them. And at the same time, we know we want to use our resources more efficiently, reduce the amount of environmental incidents and pollution. We want to move ourselves into a situation where nature is starting to be restored. And this is one of the things I wanted to kind of pick people's brains on the call, really. You know, you see graphics like this, we're quite clearly on a downward trajectory. We've all signed up to this kind of concept of trying to get by 2030 to this point of recovery. So how do we start with the tools at our disposal and these kind of frameworks for drivers and pressures and assessing of the ecosystem quality? How do we start to identify the kind of, I guess, the inflection points or these change points? How will we know when we're in the right direction? And how will we know when we start to get to the point where it's actually people and nature are thriving together? How are we going to make these choices, which are going to be difficult? As an environmentalist, we're typically going to go for the pro-environmental option, but we need to make sure we incorporate the environmental and the social. Who else is missing in this conversation? And also, you've got to kind of make sure, again, you're grounded back in the real world. So this is an aerial view of Cardiff. Quite fortunate, it's a very green city. We've got a lot of rich green infrastructure. So how are we going to start making these cities more fit for the future? How are we going to make sure that they are also delivering for the hinterland behind? You know, Cardiff is great, it's a beautiful city, but there are many people living in the ex-industrial landscapes as well. So I think I'm going to wrap the talk up there. I've gone on for slightly longer than I was hoping to, so apologies for that. More than happy to take any questions, and I've put my email up on the screen because I guess for me, what I'm hoping here is it's kind of stimulated some kind of thoughts, hopefully more questions. I'm certainly not the expert in any of this stuff, but I'd be really receptive to being contacted post-event around some of this stuff. So I think I'm going to hand back over to Martin and Christina to manage any questions. And thank you very much for indulging me. That was, there we go. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. That's fascinating. We've talked around this, just to have it all laid out like that. You did it really clearly. Just amazing job. Amazing job. Because I know how complicated it can get. Right. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions here. I won't do Martin's first because that would be a jump in the queue, wouldn't it, mate? So we have one from Graham Forbes. You have a lot of things that are aims and some quite sophisticated frameworks. How do those turn into opportunities? How do tensions at different levels get filtered through to a manageable number in the final report?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I don't think at the moment we're doing it brilliantly well, if I was being brutal. What we try to do is, and this is actually one of the cruxes of the situation, as an operational researcher, I think I'm reasonably well skilled in some of the analysis. I certainly have strong opinions on many environmental things, but I am not an expert in marine ecology. I'm not an expert in forest management, and I won't be an expert in any one of a number of other environmental domains. And I think one of the problems NRW has particularly is that we just have so much breadth of topic to cover. The big challenge for me is how do you make use of experts? So we often think, oh, let's just get all the experts in the room, and we've got a really intelligent expert room. And yes and no, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The way that we've done it typically is with a lot of internal debate. We bring the experts in a room. Each expert will write their own chapter. So the person responsible for woodland will write the woodland chapter. The coastal margin or the marine specialist will often write the coastal ones. And then there's a little bit of a process where people like my team and others will start to look across this. But really, it's those natural resource registers. What we try to do then is say, okay, well, here are the drivers and pressures. This is what we think is affecting the state of the system. And from that, by taking that kind of synthesis of the expert views, we try to tease out what could be done. Where we tend to focus is on this concept of nature-based solutions or multiple opportunities. So it's no good just doing a seawall to protect against flooding. Can you do a seawall that also delivers for biodiversity? Or can you do a environmental project that also tackles some of the health and social deprivation? And typically when we start to consider the humans in the system, we come up with slightly different opportunities. Our role is just to define the kind of the suite of things that could be done, and then we present it back to government. What should happen in an ideal world is that as we present this report back to government, they then write the policy statement that gives NRW's direction. We get a remit letter from government each year that sets out, yes, you must do sustainable development and do all of the things, but for this year explicitly, you will focus on X, Y, or Z. So we tend to get a kind of steer each year Interestingly, we've had a bit of change politically in Wales, and we've actually now got our minister to whom we answer is actually a climate change minister. So that's unusual. We don't have that in England, for example, but it also does mean then that we have a slightly different structure of civil servants. So I suppose to answer the question badly, it is a case of trying to take a sort of slice across that expert opinion alongside the evidence base that we have. And it's certainly not easy.
Mm. So to some extent, that does actually feed into what Martin was saying, because he said it would be great to talk a bit more about the pressures.
Yeah.
Pressures in that pressures model, that DIPSA model.
Yes. So when we try to take a look at that, we sort of look at, well, okay, what are the big drivers? And I have got some notes somewhere on this. What are the big kind of drivers and how we sort of pull them together? So at a kind of very large scale, and this is not NLW kind of doing the maths in a way. This is us stealing from the research that's out there. The National Ecosystem Assessment, which was built on the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, kind of basically puts these broad drivers, the kind of climate and variability, the pollution, nutrient and enrichment, the habitat change, the exploitation of resources. These are the big drivers. They culminate in pressures. So you can imagine that, okay, take the coastal example. You've got a load of people living at the coast. We know climate is more variable. It's getting increasingly changeable. There's the argument that that's going to compound weather patterns. Now, weather and climate are different. The pressure will be extreme weather. Are we set up well to deal with that? We had a really interesting challenge at one of our evidence conferences recently where an academic asked us and said, okay, you've got flood teams, you've got hydrology teams, you've got land management teams. Where's your disaster response team? Where's your extreme weather event team? And that we don't have. Is there something in the kind of titles and the roles that we do? How we start to try to define these pressures, I suppose it's saying, okay, well, getting all the experts to think it through. Take something like the coastline. It's that, well, as you build up, you start to increase the rate of sea level rise. Like sea level rise against a hard rocky coastline, you can kind of deal with it. Sea level rise against a very low-lying coastline with an eroding dune system is actually terrible. That would mean that you have rapid sea level rise and increase. Bearing in mind the UK is kind of sinking in the southeast and rising in Scotland. Wales is lucky, it sits in the middle, so we don't have that to deal with as much. We have the other problem. In a way, do we have the resources to keep holding back the tide? I mean, you could argue that places, I'm not saying I am, but you could argue that you could defend London with the Thames barrier. You can take Rotterdam and say, well, put a big barrier around it. And they do some amazing coastal engineering in Holland. But can you afford to do that everywhere? And if the rate of change increases, so how do we start doing that? So we try to tease out, based on the best available evidence and the expert opinion, how do the pressures, how do the drivers lead to the pressure? What do we think is going to be the effect on the state of the system? How confident are we in that? Like, bearing in mind a lot of the things I've talked about, we don't have huge amounts of manpower. We're having to use a lot of proxy inference. We know some things are bad, and yet we can't really put our finger on it. Do we act in a precautionary way? Yes, we do, but we're often then criticised of holding back development. I think Wales often does some quite good policy choices. We're talking in the news at the moment about trying to reduce the amount of meal deals that end up in the kind of consumer supermarkets and things. We've got situations in the South Wales valleys where 1 in 4 children in some deprived wards are considered clinically obese. You just think that's a ticking time bomb that's coming our way. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I guess, how we start to deal with it. It's these drivers of change manifest in pressures on the environment. That typically leads, not always, but typically leads to a degradation in the state of the natural resources and their resilience, which then impacts on their ability to give society all of the things that keep us alive. You know, it delivers our food, our air, our water, and how can we better live in balance with that, I suppose.
It's fascinating to... Sorry, Christina.
No, I was just thinking that those experts, those different tensions are going to be very much driven by those pressures, and a lot of them are going to go, but no, the pressure on my ecosystem is the worst.
Exactly, yeah. And they've typically got day jobs as well, and often when we're being asked, you know, they do a day job, and then every 5 years they got to do this massive piece of work and pulling it all together again. So we do a lot of ongoing things as well. What we're trying to do on a daily basis is implement a lot of this stuff. So in some sense, in an ideal world, 10 years from now, each 5-year cycle would be far easier to write, because it would be a case of aggregating all the studies, all the examples, and saying, right, here is the summative assessment of all of the work that we've been doing. But that's not always working well in practice, I suppose. Yeah, and we are very under-resourced. I think it was recognised in Welsh Parliament recently that we were about 1/3 under-resourced. When we merged, we were given more duties and more remit. We weren't given more money and resources. So we were about 1/3 under-resourced, which, depending on how you cut it, you could sit there and say, well, actually, that means we're sat here today with 2/3 of what we need. So I need 50% more resources. And that's another £100 million, which we're not going to get. And it's a drop in the ocean against a $2 trillion UK economy, which is actually driving a lot of this stuff. So yeah, it's really complex.
I'm conscious of time because we want to actually try and get onto some solution. So Mike Eworth has a question, but before I ask that, so there's two that are sort of interrelated because they're both about measurement. So Maya Tataneni, I hope I pronounced that and didn't absolutely massacre it. How do we actually determine the impact of environmental degradation? I'm currently sitting in Chicago under a warning to stay indoors due to the impact of forest fires in Canada. And I can't help but think how the state of forests in Canada is currently having such an impact on people here. I think you were actually talking about that earlier, weren't you, Luke? And then Hazel Trenberth has said, thank you, Luke. For natural capital accounts, we are trying to use the UN system of environmental economic accounting method for creating a habitat index for habitat condition. So both of these questions are about measurement, I think. Or one's a note that they're using a certain kind of measurement, and the other one is sort of like, you know, how systemically this is a worldwide issue. I mean, this isn't, you know, one country will affect another country, won't it? Because it's in the atmosphere.
Yeah, completely. And I think, you know, you go right back to sort of the early 80s and the Rio summit on sustainability. And I think the kind of strapline of think global, act local still applies today. I think the measurement issue is entirely correct, and it's really tricky for us. We don't tend to measure the impact directly. What we try to do is articulate this relationship between, if we were doing good sustainable management of natural resources, they would have a positive effect on human well-being and the economy in Wales, and we want to try to mainstream that approach within Wales. So I think maybe try not to fall too much into the valuation trap. I mean, it's not saying we desperately need good, strong natural capital accounting in Wales, and we are quite hopeful that some of the work the Office of National Statistics are doing on this is going to help us in that approach. We've got things like the commitments under 30 by 30 for nature. The one sort of point I would make is that sometimes with measurement, once things become a target, they sort of lose a little bit of their purpose. Again, not an economist, so I'm probably slightly out of my depth a little bit, but in some ways you can kind of think of, okay, well, some of this is a bit of a game. So there's the game theory approach of how do you play the game better? How do you optimize the approach to get the best result? Equally, optimizing things is kind of what's got us in this situation in the first place. So then the other reflection is mechanism design, which says, okay, we'll change the rule of the game at the same time, and how do we advocate and champion that? So I think measurement is tricky. Certainly we're getting more and more sophisticated as technology improves. It gives us more power to do remote assessments. The growth in Earth observation and remote sensing is phenomenal. Wasn't that long ago we were going out hand counting things, hand drawing maps. And then now we can do it from our desks. We can kind of get a satellite scan. So, you know, technology is amazing. I think it's how we deploy it and use it. But yeah, measurement is I guess, non-trivial. Very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely, and dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, Hazel has said you'll be pleased to know our ONS UK natural capital accounts this year for the first time will be split by the 4 nations.
Oh,
there you
perfect.
go.
There you go. There we go.
Great news, isn't it? Great news for you there, Luke. So I'm going to ask Mike if he'd like to put forward his question.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Luke, interesting talk. Some of the feedback I've been getting from researchers in this space who work a lot with governments, not just in the UK, but globally, is speed. That frequently, in order to get a government minister or a minister's team or anybody that has the power to actually do something in a room, you're limited. You get an hour, you might get 2 hours. Other feedback that I've been getting from civil servants, not in your space, but you know, across government, is that quite frequently demands for policy ideas are, can you give me something for tomorrow? You know, how much is speed? I mean, I appreciate the glossy reports and everything, but in terms of practical advice and decision making in government, how fast do you have to work?
Faster than we are right now, I would say. Right. Certainly, I mean, one thing I would say with Wales is scale is really in our favour. We often try to replicate the kind of larger functions of central government, and actually, I don't think we play to our strengths brilliantly well. What I would say in Wales, and for anybody on the call who's looking to work in case studies and areas, the Welsh public sector is a lot smaller. I would argue it's a little bit more agile. It's also less resourced. So for us, the things like that Public Service Board work and the Future Generations Act means that at least if you wanted at a more operational level, you wanted to work perhaps with the public sector and not just the civil servants, you could get quite easily to grassroots level and be able to kind of deploy and implement things at speed. I think we are quite bad at getting good enough analysis into the right hands quick enough. I think sometimes we often worry about decimal points of precision or all the content within a report, but actually, is it in the right place at the right time? I mean, clearly, when you look at the trends on both climate and biodiversity, we are not acting fast enough, and we're probably not deploying things quickly enough. I guess that's some of the problem in having a kind of democratic approach to things, is that things take a little bit more time if you were to kind of impose a decision. Or we often would then get a lot of criticism if we tried to do things without consultation. So it is one of the kind of goals on that Future Generations Act is this whole concept of collaboration. And I think one of the things we've not properly explored is just how difficult and time consuming that is. To adequately consult properly across a very broad, diverse range of opinion takes time. It's arguably more effective. So I don't really think I have a good answer for you other than to say I kind of agree speed is the essence, I suppose.
Well, it's just that I have, the researcher that I was speaking to recently, who is a very long experience in this field from a methodology point of view, was talking about a government preparing for an event that might happen in the future, and assembled the relevant sort of civil servants, ministers, experts, and literally did the work in an afternoon. And you got the feeling that what was actually achieved there was more than what Westminster government has achieved for a recent event that occurred in this country, with disastrous consequences. So, it is possible, when you go back to that kind of map that you showed of methodologies, shall we say, to deploy those at speed and achieve quite good results.
Yeah.
If you've got people who are able to work at that sort of speed.
It's definitely where we're trying to move towards. I think one thing I'm quite hopeful for is that kind of systems-based approach seems to be gathering a lot more momentum within the civil service. I think one thing we have suffered with in the past is the kind of turnover of staff and the rates of change within civil service. In my sector, people don't tend to move on as much. So you quite often will find people who've been in a job for quite a long time. They are the expert in lower plant species or freshwater ecology or something like that. And actually then you've got a kind of consistent point of contact. I think sometimes with a lot of people chopping and changing departments can be quite tricky. I just come back to that point. In Wales, we are a much smaller public sector. It's not actually as difficult for us. We have good lines of communication with the Welsh government. We've got a little bit more integration, I would argue, across the departments. With that comes some complexity. So I think it's possibly in a better space in Wales, at least, than it's been for some time. So I think there is opportunity there to work at pace, and we are quite open to that kind of way of working. But yeah, you can't really can't be quick enough in my mind in this work.
Okay, that's great, Luke. Thanks for that.
So kind of on that note, I've not had any more questions come through in the chat. I kind of like to move it on to potential solutions. And I have an idea that, typical for me, who's all about human-centered stuff, is about sort of engagement of communities. How much do you actively engage communities in helping you to tackle some of these problems and tackle some of the measurements side of things as well? Become more involved with nature so that they become more connected to it, and they're actually partaking of helping with some of these issues?
Yeah,
is the work being done?
There is not enough, and probably to pick up on Michael's point, probably not enough, and certainly not quick enough. We've been worse in the past. I think one of the things that's kind of been really positive in the last couple of years is we've had a particular piece of work which we called Natur and ni, and it's the Welsh for nature and us. And it was a bit of a project in saying, well, you don't really want environmentalists writing environmental visions for the future of Wales, because if you do, you're going to get the typical kind of, I want to go up a mountain, I want a nice green tranquil space. What we tried to do is we said, okay, how would we speak speak to the population of Wales. Now, bearing in mind, we're not the Office of National Statistics. We don't have all that expertise in doing rigorous census approaches and all the rest of it. But we did try to do kind of countrywide campaign. We tried to go outside our usual suspects. I'm not saying we did that brilliantly. But we tried to go beyond the environmental NGOs. We were basically asking the question, okay, well, what would a future in Wales look like to you where we were living and thriving with nature? So 2050 or 2030, depending on how we approached it. We took a series of scenarios out. One of the best outcomes of that was not all the work that we did and the scenario development, some of the marketing and the campaigns. It was actually towards the end of the project, we kind of realized that despite our best efforts, we'd not been as representative as we wanted to be. We'd failed to engage all of the right people. So we actually did a bit of a sortition process, and we worked with a company who was experienced in doing that. We set up a bit of a citizens panel to kind of look at this and to try to take a kind of, what is a representative panel of people in Wales saying? That was really good. We've obviously not done that in a kind of, at the moment, we're not sure about how long lived that will be. So I'm hoping that based on that, we've seen some of the value in it, and actually we're going to do more and more community engagement. If you again go to the literature of why we've been set up the way we are, what that means is that we often have these place-based teams. So at a local level, if you're in a locality in Wales and you're interested in that natural environment, it's probably quite easy to get involved with NRW at an operational level. Probably for me, the disconnect then is between kind of that operational local need and what happens at a national level because of all those constraints. So I think we do community engagement. We're probably not well skilled at it generally, although there are kind of colleagues in the business who are really good. And I think the NatUNE program was good. Our work on area statements, where we tried to take some of this environmental legislation and write a local statement about the reflection of place, which can only be done by working with local people. I think where we've struggled a little bit is in capturing the full range of opinions. It's difficult with things like Brexit and the political instabilities that we've had. Quite clearly, there are some strongly held and divisive viewpoints around, well, what should be done post common agricultural policy and things like that. But yeah, I would agree. I think community engagement has got to be core, and stakeholder engagement as well. The challenge for us is how do we work with communities and stakeholders to start to identify that kind of when we are on that change point. The Sonar report is supposed to be that kind of assessment back to government. So how can we say to them, or when can we say to them, look, we've identified a change in the state of this system and we're actually going in the right direction. So for me, the kind of issues we've yet to tackle really are how do we make better use of expertise, and how do we start to identify these kind of change points?
So I could converse with you a lot more about that one, but maybe at a later date. So Graham has got his hand up. Graham Forbes.
Right, yeah. So in terms of the suggestions of what one does, I guess one of the things I was thinking was that reducing the complexity that you're dealing with, particularly when you're trying to communicate with government. So there's a lot of information in that. If you've got a 50-page executive summary, that sounds like none of it's getting read. So one thing is opportunities are notably fleeting in time. So you find the right moment to have a conversation. If you have a quick conversation at the right moment, stuff really happens. And so breaking stuff down into opportunities that you can pursue and being ready for when the moment comes. So the report's really useful because if someone asks the question, you've got it ready to go, but really anticipating those opportunities and having done the work with the communities before that opportunity arises, like that's how you get the opportunities to turn into action, I would think.
Yeah, no, I don't think we do that well at the moment. If you just think of the kind of for us, each time this cycle comes around, it's a huge piece of work. We're drowning in the day job. We don't have enough resources to do this. I think you're absolutely right. How we kind of get ourselves ready to take advantage of these opportunities as and when they do. We can plan and predict and forecast to the best of our ability, but we also then still need to remain agile enough to pivot and take advantage. One of the things I think we did really benefit from, as much as it's not nice to benefit from things like the pandemic, I actually think that did reframe some of the discussions. And I think it was, if you just looked at that first lockdown when the number of people were only exploring their local environmental quality, and what started to matter to people were the kind of local parks there. How good were they? Were they able to get their children out and play and kind of could they walk to those places? So I think, yeah, for us to take better, I think for me, it comes back to some of the points I was making in the talk, really. We don't really have a good handle on all the different stakeholders and public opinion. We're getting much better at engagement, but there's still a long way to go, and we're not the experts in it. And how we get ourselves, like for us, many of the opportunities are not within our gift. So quite often the levers that need to be pulled in order to make some of this stuff happen sit outside our control. So we're often trying to influence other bits of government. And typically then there's that issue of where, well, quite often each bit is semi-siloed. So yeah, I don't have an adequate answer to that, but I would agree with you. Yes, opportunities and being able to kind of be agile enough to take advantage of them when they present.
So that actually feeds very nicely into something that Daniel Arthur has said. Following from the comments about systems thinking, what do you find is lacking or deficient in its tools, approaches, methods, communication, given, as you say, that systems thinking in government is becoming more widely used? What do systems thinkers need to do better?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if anybody's seen the film Fight Club. But the thing that springs to mind is, firstly, don't call it systems thinking quite often. It's different. If you're in a room full of OR people or engineers or people who kind of really love nerding out on that stuff, absolutely, let's go to town, let's do all the equations and kind of get it really nailed down. I think for me, often the point of systems thinking, or any toolkit or framework for that, I think one of the problems we have is we get rigidly fixated on any one of them. Some people love the systems map, some people love the theory of changes, some people love the futures approaches or the kind of social science frameworks. For me, they're just kind of tools. So I think firstly, I would say don't get too wedded to a technique. Don't be disappointed if people tear your maps apart. Actually, there's a really good chap in Bayes, Adam, and I'm lost his surname for a moment. I hope he's not on the call, but I'll hopefully remember it in a moment. But I remember when I first kind of came into the role, I was talking to Adam in Bayes about kind of how he's promoting a lot of the systems thinking in government. And I think one of the things he was saying was actually a demonstration of success is when you take your systems map around, by the end of that process, it's unrecognizable to you to an extent. And what you've had is everybody pull it apart and tear it apart. And ultimately what you want is to better understand the problem. If you can just uncover a few things, that can often be quite beneficial. So I think perhaps some of the things that we can do as systems thinker is to try to simplify the language, to not get too fixated on whether it's hard or soft. I think if you go full circle in any one of those, you come back around again. So yeah, by all means, do the hard maths, but don't put people off with it as well. I suppose it's trying to, the crux of all the tools and frameworks and methodologies for me is not the tool or framework or methodology, it's in the people using it. So have you got the right people in the room? And by right, only you can say that within the context of your problem. So if as environmental professionals, we're all sat there, we all went to the same universities, we studied the same degrees, we speak the same language, we wear the same kind of clothing and share the same worldview and ideology, you are by default missing a large bits of the picture. So I think for systems thinking, it works really well when you get a very diverse range of people in the room. Never underestimate the power of external facilitators in diffusing and bringing together people. And I think, yeah, that would be my general take on it personally.
Sounds very PSM. Yeah. Mike knows that one. Yeah, it should be bespoke for every situation. It's like spot on. And you're always using a systems approach. Design is key. Yeah, so it's like, got to design every interaction well. And it occurs to me that a lot of this is about networks, isn't it? And seeding networks. And trying to seed that for the future, as Graham was saying, sort of if it's primed, if people are primed to partake and primed to get involved, then it makes it much easier to tip it over, doesn't it, when the time comes?
I actually think that network point's entirely the issue for me. When we, even within our own organization, 2,000 odd people, if you think about, okay, well, everybody needs to know what everybody's doing, you compare all those people off, you can have a number of unique combinations of conversations, but you're talking like 2 million people, 2 million individual conversations. And that's just, to do that sequentially would be nigh on impossible. By the time you went through it, all the context would have changed. So what I think we should be thinking about a little bit more is, how do we kind of map out the networks and how do we identify those key connectors? If you need to get a message across domains, across disciplines, how do we traverse the graph essentially? That kind of stuff, I think we're not brilliant at doing either.
So I'm very conscious that we've hit 6 o'clock. So what I would like to do is I would love to have Luke come back and talk to us again, and perhaps we can actually focus more on these particular issues that we've identified as being quite key. That is stakeholders and networks and seeding people, priming them, perhaps almost nudging. Maybe we're talking about behavioural OR here.
Yeah, behaviour.
Yeah.
And that change point stuff as well, the kind of how we identify the change.
Exactly. So if people from this call have any ideas that they would like to pass on to Luke, please either get directly in touch with Luke or pass them on to me and Martin, and we can pass them on to him. That's not a problem. But I would also say, let's put our thoughts together and let's see if we can cook up a really interactive and productive session to give NRW some really useful tools to use, and perhaps some contacts of people who can help them to use those tools as well. Does that sound good to everyone?
Great with me. Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards with just any reflections as well, feel free. I pop my email up and it should be on the notes for the meeting. So
apparently the guy's name was Adam Jones as well.
That's it. Yes. A good Welsh name as well. I should have remembered. Adam. I knew
indeed,
I got the first
indeed.
Yeah, Adam's brilliant.
I noticed we got a token Menai Bridge noted up on the pictures.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, North Wales here.
Yeah.
So is everybody okay with that, or does anybody have any very, very strong ideas that they'd like to put in the chat before we go? Or shall I wrap things up?
Can I just say a huge thank you to you, Luke. I think it's a really fascinating problem, a very classic sort of thing that systems thinkers can help with. And I also suggest just a quick sort of appeal to everyone. If you've got anything you'd like to present, do drop a note to Christine and me. You can do it via the special interest group page on the OR Society website. And just right at the bottom of the page, there's a sort of get in touch box. And if there's something that you'd like to present, area you'd like to talk about, or something you want to just discuss with the group as a SIG, it would be great to sort of bring some new thoughts, new ideas along as well.
Well, perhaps now Mike is not quite as busy as he used to be. He might actually come and talk to us about value in PSMs. That would be good. Maybe I can pin him down soon. Yeah, no, where is? I'm doing it again. I'm saying, while I've got you here.
I got caught earlier on.
Oh, I don't miss the trick. Marvellous.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Maya, we always try and do them at this time of day. So thank you very much for coming. So we're getting lots of positive comments in the chat. Luke, I think you can see them.
There we go. Oh, it's just really nice to be able to share some of the work that we're doing here, and just look forward to kind of working with you all more on this. I think it'll be
it's really good to see you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks then.
Yeah,
thanks.
There we go.
Great stuff.